My aunt smashed a wine glass at Thanksgiving because I hid my pregnancy, so I exposed her biggest secret. My aunt hurled a wine glass into the dining room wall on Thanksgiving because I had not told her about my pregnancy before announcing it to the rest of the family. She screamed that real family shared everything immediately and accused me of humiliating her on purpose. So, while she stood there lecturing everyone about loyalty, I told the room the one secret she had been desperate to keep hidden. She had been taking money from my 83-year-old grandmother's accounts for years. My husband Grant and I found out I was pregnant in early October after trying for almost 3 years. I can still remember staring at the test in our bathroom, afraid to blink because I thought the second line might disappear. We were thrilled, but the happiness came tangled with fear. The winter before, I had suffered a miscarriage that left both of us devastated. We had gone from talking about names and nursery colors to moving through the house in silence, neither of us knowing how to comfort the other. This time, my doctor said everything looked healthy, but she also understood why I was anxious and recommended that we wait until after 12 weeks before telling the family. Grant and I decided Thanksgiving would be the right moment. Everyone would already be together, and I would be 14 weeks along by then. I told only my sister, Natalie, and my cousin Trevor because they had known about the miscarriage and had checked on me every week afterward. They promised to keep the pregnancy private until we were ready, and they did. My mother's older sister, Denise, was 58 and had spent years appointing herself the unofficial manager of the entire family. Nobody had elected her to that role, but she behaved as if every piece of family news had to pass through her first. She needed to know who was dating whom, who was having medical tests, who was changing jobs, and who was quietly struggling. More importantly, she needed to be the person who announced those things to everyone else. The week before Thanksgiving, she called me and asked whether I had any news I wanted to share with her. I told her no and said I was simply looking forward to seeing everyone. She replied that I sounded different and asked whether something was going on. I changed the subject to her garden, and after a few probing questions, she let it go. Still, I could hear suspicion in her voice. I had good reasons not to trust her with the pregnancy. When Grant and I got engaged, I called Denise because I was happy and wanted to include her. Less than an hour later, she posted the news on Facebook with a photograph she had taken from my private page. She tagged half the family before I had even told my own grandmother. When I received a promotion at work, Denise announced it during Sunday dinner before I arrived. When Grant and I bought our house, she put a photograph and a long congratulatory paragraph in the family group chat before we had the chance to tell anyone ourselves. Every time, she insisted she was simply too excited to keep quiet. But it never felt like excitement. It felt like ownership. She wanted to be the person holding the information because knowing first made her feel important. There was another reason everyone tolerated Denise's controlling behavior. For several years, she had been Grandma Evelyn's primary caretaker. Grandma was 83, still lived in her own house, and remained fairly independent, but Denise handled the practical parts of her life. She scheduled medical appointments, bought groceries, arranged transportation, paid bills, and managed the bank accounts. After my grandfather died, the family had been grateful that Denise volunteered to take over so much. My mother often said she did not know what they would do without her. Other relatives called her a saint. Denise always waved away the praise and said, "Family takes care of family," but she clearly enjoyed being viewed as the person holding everyone together. That image gave her status, trust, and access. At the time, almost everyone believed she had earned all three. Thanksgiving was held at my parents' house that year instead of Denise's, which seemed to irritate her before dinner even began. She corrected my mother about where the serving dishes should go, complained that the turkey had rested too long, and repeatedly reminded people that things ran more smoothly when she hosted. I tried not to let her mood affect me. All through dinner, Grant kept brushing his knee against mine under the table, a quiet reminder that we were about to share the news we had waited so long to give. After dessert, I stood and said we had an announcement. My voice shook, but I smiled and told everyone that we were expecting a baby in May. The room erupted. Natalie started crying. My mother covered her mouth with both hands. Grandma Evelyn clapped and laughed, and my father came around the table to hug Grant and me. Trevor grinned at me from across the room, relieved that the secret was finally public. For a few seconds, the moment was exactly what I had hoped it would be. Then I looked at Denise. She was still sitting in her chair, staring at me with her jaw clenched. Her eyes filled with tears, but they were not happy tears. They were angry, wounded tears, as if my pregnancy were something I had done to her. She asked how long I had known. I told her about 6 weeks. Denise stood so quickly that her chair scraped hard across the floor. She demanded to know why I had not told her first. Before I could answer, she started shouting that she was the person who held the family together and the one everyone came to with important news. She said, I had gone behind her back and treated her like a stranger. Then she asked who else had known. Natalie and Trevor both went still, and Denise read the answer on their faces. She turned on them, accusing them of conspiring with me and deliberately freezing her out. My mother tried to calm her, but Denise demanded to know whether she had known too. When my mother said no, Denise did not believe her. My father told Denise to sit down and be happy for me. Instead, she said I had deliberately made her the last person to know because I wanted to humiliate her in front of the family. She listed everything she claimed to sacrifice for us and asked whether this was how I repaid her. Then she attacked Grant, saying he had turned me against my own relatives and taught me to shut people out. Grant stayed calm and explained that we had waited because of the miscarriage and because my doctor had advised us to get past the most vulnerable stage of the pregnancy. Denise dismissed that as an excuse. She said I had clearly wanted to make her feel small. Then she said, "Real family tells each other everything immediately. That is what loyalty is." Hearing those words from her nearly made me laugh, though nothing about the moment was funny. Natalie finally lost patience and said, "Maybe people would tell you things if you could keep one secret to yourself." Denise grabbed her wine glass and threw it at the wall. It shattered above the baseboard, spraying glass across the floor. Natalie's 4-year-old son burst into tears. Grandma Evelyn flinched so violently that she dropped her fork. Denise's husband, Howard, jumped up and tried to lead her away, but she refused to leave. She said she was not going anywhere until I apologized for disrespecting her. I told her I would not apologize for protecting my own pregnancy announcement, after everything Grant and I had been through. Denise called me selfish and ungrateful. She announced that she was done with me, ordered her children to get their coats, and began shoving the serving dishes she had brought into bags. She was packing them with furious theatrical movements while continuing to lecture the entire room about loyalty, sacrifice, and family honesty. Something in me changed as I watched her. I had spent a month carrying a secret that frightened me. A secret involving Grandma Evelyn's money and the possibility that the woman everyone trusted was exploiting her. I had been afraid to speak because I knew the truth could fracture the family. But Denise was standing there demanding total openness while punishing me for protecting private medical news. The hypocrisy was more than I could take. I stood and said, "Since real family is supposed to share everything, everyone should know that Denise has been taking money from Grandma Evelyn's accounts for the last 2 years." Howard froze with his coat halfway on. Denise's face lost all its color. The room went so quiet that I could hear Natalie's son crying in the next breath. Howard looked at his wife, then at me, and the confusion on his face turned into something close to horror. He had not known. He had trusted Denise to handle their household finances, just as the rest of us had trusted her with Grandma's. Denise's hands began shaking around the bag she was holding. She tried to speak, but only a strained sound came out. Grandma Evelyn looked from one person to another and asked in a small voice whether her money was gone. My mother moved immediately to Grandma's side. Howard set down the serving dish he had been carrying, picked up his keys, and headed for the front door. Denise finally found her voice and called after him, saying it was not what he thought and that she could explain. He did not stop. She ran outside after him, and we could hear her shouting his name in the driveway. Her 2 teenage children stayed at the table, staring down as though they wanted to disappear. My father sat motionless, looking stunned. Trevor began picking up the largest pieces of broken glass because everyone else seemed incapable of moving. Grant reached under the table and squeezed my hand. A car door slammed outside, followed by the sound of an engine. Denise's voice grew more desperate, but Howard drove away. For a while, the only sounds in the house were the child crying and Grandma Evelyn asking what was happening. Denise came back inside about 20 minutes later. Her makeup had run down her face, and she was breathing hard. She said Howard had left and was not answering his phone. She called him again in front of us, and the call went directly to voicemail. Her hands shook so badly that she dropped the phone while trying to send a message. Then she looked at me with pure hatred. She screamed that I had destroyed her marriage and ruined her entire life over a pregnancy announcement. She accused me of planning the reveal and waiting for the perfect moment to humiliate her. Grant stood and said that was not true. He reminded her that she had started the confrontation, thrown a glass, terrified a child, and demanded an apology from me. Denise told him to shut up and again accused him of poisoning me against my own family. My father finally spoke. His voice was quiet, but harder than I had ever heard it. He told Denise that she needed to take responsibility for her own choices. I had not made her take Grandma's money, and I had not made her lie to everyone, including her husband. Denise turned on him and said nobody understood the pressure she had been under. She claimed she had been drowning for years and that her life was much harder behind the scenes than any of us knew. Then the anger seemed to drain out of her. She collapsed into a dining chair, covered her face, and began sobbing. My mother, somehow still able to show compassion, put a hand on her shoulder. Denise said she had never meant for any of it to happen, and that she had always intended to repay every dollar. She kept saying she only needed time. But even while apologizing, she looked at Grandma and my mother, not at me. My mother gently told her to take the children home because everyone needed space. Denise nodded, gathered her teenagers, and finished packing her dishes with trembling hands. She did not look at me before leaving. Once the door closed, the rest of us stood in the remains of what was supposed to have been a joyful holiday. Trevor swept up the broken glass. Natalie and I cleared the table without speaking. My mother sat beside Grandma Evelyn and held her hand while Grandma repeatedly asked whether she was going to lose her house. My father stared through the front window. Grant helped carry dishes into the kitchen, but the entire house felt heavy and wrong. Grant and I stayed for about an hour to help clean, then drove home. At first, neither of us spoke. Halfway there, I started crying so hard that I could barely breathe. I had imagined the announcement as a happy memory after years of trying and the loss we had endured. Instead, the evening had ended with shattered glass, a terrified grandmother, 2 humiliated teenagers, and a marriage possibly collapsing in a driveway. Grant reached across the console and held my hand. He told me Denise's decisions were not my fault. He reminded me that she had attacked me first, dismissed the miscarriage, and turned our announcement into a public trial. I knew he was right, but I still felt sick when I pictured Howard's face and heard Grandma Evelyn asking whether her money was gone. When we reached home, Grant turned off the car and held me while I cried against his shoulder. Inside, I took a long shower and cried again. He made tea, put on a movie, and sat beside me on the couch, though neither of us followed the plot. The next morning, I woke to 17 missed calls and a screen full of messages. My parents, Natalie, Trevor, and relatives I rarely spoke to all wanted to know what had happened. The longest message came from my mother. She asked me to call as soon as I was awake and explain exactly how I knew about the money. She answered on the first ring. I told her that about a month earlier, I had gone to Grandma Evelyn's house to help set up a new tablet and pay a few bills online because Denise had been busy. When I logged into Grandma's bank account, the checking balance was almost empty. That made no sense. Grandma had a reliable pension, owned her home outright, and lived modestly. I started reviewing the transaction history and saw repeated transfers to Denise. Some were only a few $100s, but others were in the thousands, and they stretched back month after month. Then I saw a notification connected to a home equity line of credit opened against Grandma's house. I had asked Grandma Evelyn whether she knew about it. She seemed confused and said Denise had brought her papers to sign, but had not clearly explained what they were. Grandma trusted her daughter and assumed the documents had something to do with bills. I did not know whether Denise had legal authority to make all of those moves, whether Grandma had technically signed permission, or whether there was an explanation I had not seen. I also knew that confronting Denise without understanding the full situation could create chaos and possibly frighten Grandma. So I had carried the information for a month, trying to decide how to raise it responsibly. I had taken note of what I saw, but I had not gone digging through every account because I was not authorized to conduct an investigation. I kept hoping there was some explanation that would make the transactions less alarming. My mother was silent for a long time. Then she said she wished I had come to her privately instead of revealing it in front of everyone. I told her I wished Denise had not thrown a wine glass and screamed at me for protecting my pregnancy. My mother said she understood that I had been defending myself, but the way the truth came out had caused enormous damage. Denise had called her at 3 a.m, hysterical because Howard still would not answer. Grandma Evelyn had barely slept. I did not deny any of that. I only said that the damage began with Denise's actions, not with the fact that I finally named them. My father called separately about an hour later. He said he supported me and believed Denise had needed a serious wake-up call for years. He was tired of watching her control the family and then hide behind the idea that she was helping everyone. Still, he was worried about Grandma, Howard, and the children. He asked whether I knew the total amount missing. I said I did not. I had only seen enough of the statements to know the transfers were substantial and that the home equity account existed. My father said Howard was probably going through every record by then, and he feared the truth would be worse than any of us wanted. 3 days passed without direct contact from Denise. I texted once to ask whether she was safe, but she did not respond. Natalie drove past the house and saw both cars in the driveway, though nobody answered the door. My mother kept calling. Denise finally picked up once and said she was fine but needed space. Howard answered my father on the 3rd day. He said he was staying with his brother Raymond and needed time to think. My father offered to come over, but Howard said he was not ready to talk. That afternoon, Raymond called my father because Howard had arrived at his home on Thanksgiving looking like a ghost and had barely spoken since. My father explained the pregnancy announcement, Denise's meltdown, the glass, and my accusation about Grandma's money. Raymond listened, then asked how serious the financial issue was. My father admitted that none of us knew the full amount yet, but Denise had acknowledged taking money over a long period. Raymond said the situation was likely to become ugly and hoped the family was prepared. Hearing that made the crisis feel even more real. This was no longer only a disastrous argument. There were financial records, a vulnerable elderly woman, and a husband discovering that the life he trusted might have been built on lies. I spent the next several days hiding in our house as much as possible. Grant had to return to work, so I was alone with my thoughts and a phone that kept lighting up. I ignored most messages because I did not have the energy to defend myself to people who had not been there. On Tuesday evening, Natalie came over with Thai food and used the spare key. She did not ask whether I was hungry. She simply opened the containers, handed me a plate, and sat with me at the kitchen counter. That quiet practicality was exactly what I needed. While we ate, she showed me several posts Denise had made on Facebook. One said blood did not always mean loyalty. Another said some people smiled in your face while waiting to stab you in the back. Relatives had filled the comments with questions and sympathy. Under one post, another aunt had asked whether it was about Thanksgiving. Denise replied with a crying emoji and wrote that certain people in the family had finally shown their true colors. She never mentioned throwing the glass, terrifying a child, or taking money from Grandma Evelyn. She was presenting herself as the devoted aunt betrayed by an ungrateful niece. Natalie told me not to let it get into my head because anyone with sense would see through it. I wanted to believe her, but most of the extended family had not witnessed the dinner. They were receiving fragments through social media and private calls, and Denise had always been skilled at making people feel sorry for her. The next afternoon, Trevor texted that his mother had called asking what happened. Someone had told her I had stood up during dinner and exposed Denise's private financial problems because I was angry she had not been told about the pregnancy first. In that version, I was the one having a tantrum, while Denise was simply the victim of a cruel public attack. Trevor corrected the story, but he was not sure his mother fully believed him. He guessed the distorted version had come from Denise, or someone close to her. I was furious. Denise was not only avoiding responsibility, she was actively replacing the truth with a story that preserved her reputation. Half the extended family might now think I had weaponized a private hardship for entertainment. I wanted to respond publicly, list every fact, and force everyone to understand. Grant urged me not to fight through social media. He said anything I posted in anger could create another argument and distract from the actual issue, which was protecting Grandma Evelyn and determining what had happened to her money. On Thursday morning, my mother called and proposed a family meeting for Sunday. She said we needed to sit down calmly before the conflict tore everyone apart. Denise and Howard would both be invited. My stomach tightened at the thought of another confrontation while I was pregnant. I told her I did not want the stress and that Denise was the one spreading lies. My mother sighed and said that was exactly why we needed a face-to-face conversation. After I hung up, Grant stopped what he was doing and looked at me carefully. He said that if we stayed away, Denise could control the entire narrative. He offered to remain beside me and leave immediately if the conversation became unsafe. I agreed to go. Sunday arrived too quickly. Natalie was already at my parents' house when Grant and I entered, and Trevor came a few minutes later. My parents had made coffee and set out cookies, as if ordinary refreshments could make the meeting feel less serious. Then Howard walked in alone. He looked exhausted, with red eyes and dark circles beneath them. My mother asked where Denise was. He showed us a message in which she said she refused to be in the same room with me and had nothing to say to the family. My father shook his head, but no one was surprised. We sat in the living room in painful silence until Howard cleared his throat. He said he had spent the previous days going through bank statements, credit card records, online accounts, and deleted emails. The truth was much worse than what I had seen. Denise had not been taking money for 2 years. The transfers went back closer to 4. She had moved tens of thousands of dollars from Grandma Evelyn's accounts, often in smaller amounts that were less likely to draw attention. She had borrowed against Grandma's house through the equity line and opened a credit card in Grandma's name. Howard's voice cracked as he explained that the deception extended into their own marriage. For years, Denise had told him their finances were stable. In reality, they had large credit card balances, accounts he did not know existed, and communications from a debt settlement company that she had deleted. Because she managed the bills and accounts, he had accepted her reassurances. He said the woman he had been married to for 30 years had been living an entirely different financial life, and he felt like a fool for never seeing it. Natalie asked what he planned to do. Howard said he was considering separation because he could not look at Denise without wondering what else she had hidden. Then he asked whether anyone else had known before Thanksgiving. Everyone said no, except me. I explained again that I had found the transactions about a month earlier while helping Grandma and had not known the full scope. Howard nodded slowly. To my surprise, he was not angry with me. He thanked me for speaking, even though the truth came out in a disastrous way. He said that without that moment, he might still be living inside the lie. My mother said perhaps I could have handled it differently by taking Howard aside privately. Heat rose into my face. I reminded her that Denise had been screaming, insulting Grant, throwing objects, and demanding a public apology. I had not spent that moment calmly designing the ideal disclosure plan. I had reacted after the happiest news of my life was hijacked, and my previous miscarriage was dismissed as an excuse. My father immediately supported me. He said Denise had created the situation through years of choices, and that I should not be blamed because the family could no longer protect her from the consequences. My mother looked as though she wanted to argue, but she stopped. The conversation shifted to the person who mattered most, Grandma Evelyn. Whatever happened to Denise's marriage, she could not retain access to Grandma's money. Grandma did not want criminal charges brought against her own daughter, and the family did not force her. Still, everyone agreed that the accounts had to be secured immediately and reviewed by a professional. My mother would take over the day-to-day finances, with oversight from an attorney experienced in elder financial matters. Denise would have to sign back control, disclose every account and debt connected to Grandma, and agree to a repayment plan. If she refused, the family would consider stronger action to protect Grandma's home and remaining assets. Howard said that if Denise wanted any chance of saving their marriage or rebuilding trust with the family, she would need individual therapy, financial counseling, complete transparency, and permanent removal from anyone else's finances. He was not presenting those conditions as suggestions. For the first time since Thanksgiving, I felt that practical steps were replacing confusion. The money could not be restored overnight, and the emotional damage would not disappear. But Grandma would no longer be dependent on the person who had exploited her trust. That evening, I received a Facebook message from a family friend named Louise Harper, someone who had known my parents for decades but whom I had not spoken to in years. She said she had heard enough about Thanksgiving to understand the basic situation. 8 years earlier, her brother had managed their mother's finances and quietly drained most of the money before anyone discovered it. Louise had been the person who found the records and spoke up. At first, several relatives blamed her for dividing the family instead of blaming the person who had taken the money. She said it took years for some of them to accept that revealing a betrayal was not the same as causing it. Louise offered to talk, and we spent more than an hour on the phone. She told me that guilt was common for the person who exposed a secret because everyone suddenly connected the pain with the moment of disclosure. But the pain existed before anyone named it. She encouraged me to be precise about boundaries and to stop trying to convince every relative who preferred Denise's version. She also said that some people might never change because accepting the truth would require them to admit they had ignored warning signs. Her experience did not erase my guilt, but it made me feel less alone. She understood the strange position of being both relieved that the truth was out and horrified by the damage surrounding it. 2 weeks passed without direct contact from Denise. I received updates through my mother and Natalie. Denise and Howard had begun counseling. Howard moved back into the house, but they slept in separate rooms. Denise met with the attorney, transferred control of Grandma Evelyn's finances, and signed documents establishing a repayment plan. My mother could now see the accounts, and the attorney would review major transactions. Denise also started individual therapy. I did not know whether she was genuinely changing or simply doing whatever was necessary to prevent her marriage and family relationships from collapsing, but at least Grandma's money was finally protected. On a Wednesday afternoon, Denise texted that she needed to speak with me in person, just the two of us. My hands shook when I read it. I showed Grant, and he asked whether I wanted him nearby. I said yes without hesitation. I suggested a public coffee shop near our house and told Denise that Grant would be with me. She agreed. We arranged to meet Saturday at 10 in the morning. Grant and I arrived 15 minutes early and chose a table in the back corner. I ordered decaf and tried to slow my breathing. Denise entered exactly at 10. She wore no makeup, her hair was pulled back, and the dark circles beneath her eyes made her look older. She sat across from us and began crying almost immediately. She said her life was falling apart. Howard could barely look at her, her children were ashamed, and she could not sleep or eat. I listened without interrupting because I needed to know whether she had come to accept responsibility or only to ask me to relieve her pain. Eventually, she looked directly at me and said throwing the wine glass had been wrong. There was no excuse and she was sorry. I stayed quiet. Denise continued, admitting that she had been jealous of me for years. From her perspective, my marriage, career, home, and pregnancy all seemed to come easily, while she felt trapped and invisible. I almost interrupted because nothing about the miscarriage or 3 years of trying had been easy, but I let her finish. She was describing the story she had told herself, not the reality of my life. Then she explained what had been underneath both the money and her obsession with controlling family news. She and Howard had been drowning in debt for years. She had made poor financial decisions, hidden them out of shame, and then created more lies to protect the image that she had everything under control. When their situation became desperate, she began taking money from Grandma Evelyn's accounts and telling herself it was temporary. She believed she could replace it before anyone noticed. Instead, each transfer made the next one easier, while the growing debt made repayment less realistic. She said she hated herself every time, but felt even more terrified of admitting that the family's dependable fixer was failing. Being the person who knew everything first and handled everyone's problems had become her entire identity. If she was not the organizer, caretaker, or source of family information, she felt as if she did not matter. Her therapist had helped her see that her financial deception and her need to control other people's announcements came from the same place. Both allowed her to feel powerful and necessary when she privately felt as though she were disappearing. She said Howard had given her firm conditions for remaining in the marriage. She had already attended 3 individual sessions, they were beginning couples counseling, and she was meeting with a financial counselor. She claimed she was trying to change, and that facing what she had done was the hardest thing she had ever experienced. I sat with that for a moment. Understanding the motive did not excuse the behavior, but it made the pattern clearer. I told Denise I forgave her for the Thanksgiving outburst in the sense that I did not want to carry the fight forever. However, forgiveness did not mean immediate trust. I needed firm boundaries. She was never to take another dollar from Grandma, never to share my private news before I did, never to arrive at my home uninvited, and never to turn my milestones into opportunities to make herself the center of attention. If she crossed those lines, I would step back without arguing. Denise nodded and said she understood. She asked whether I might consider family therapy with her later. I said perhaps, after both of us had time to work separately. When we stood to leave, she hugged me. It was not the exaggerated embrace she usually performed in front of relatives. She simply held on for a moment, then let go. I did not walk out believing everything was repaired, but I believed the conversation had been more honest than any we had ever had. A few days later, my father called with an update from Howard. He and Denise were seeing a marriage counselor named Dr. Martin Cole, who focused on betrayal and rebuilding trust. Denise was also working with a separate financial counselor. Howard had moved home but remained in the guest room. His conditions had not changed. Full access to every account, individual therapy without excuses, a real repayment plan for Grandma Evelyn, and a permanent rule that Denise would never manage another relative's finances. My father said Howard wanted the marriage to survive, but he was no longer willing to confuse loyalty with blindness. My next prenatal appointment was 2 days later. Grant came with me, as he always did. The ultrasound technician measured the baby and said everything was developing exactly as expected. My doctor checked my blood pressure, asked about my stress, and reminded me that prolonged family conflict could take a toll, even when the pregnancy itself was healthy. I admitted that the previous weeks had been difficult. She encouraged me to rest, rely on Grant, and leave conversations that became overwhelming. Hearing that the baby was doing well loosened something in my chest. For the first time since Thanksgiving, I could focus on the life growing inside me, rather than the family crisis surrounding it. That weekend, Denise texted me a photograph of a worksheet from therapy. The assignment asked her to list times she had crossed someone's boundaries or deceived them, and to identify what making amends might require. Grandma Evelyn's money was at the top, but the page continued. Denise had announced Natalie's first pregnancy before Natalie was ready. She had told extended relatives about Trevor's divorce. She had accepted praise for organizing a family reunion that my mother had actually planned. She had borrowed money from 2 relatives years earlier and never repaid it. She had allowed everyone to believe she covered Grandma's care expenses herself when she was using Grandma's funds. There were 12 entries on the first page alone. Looking at them, I realized the Thanksgiving explosion had not created a new problem. It had exposed a pattern that had shaped the family for years. Denise repeatedly took control of information, money, or credit, because being central to the story made her feel valuable. I texted that I appreciated her honesty. She replied with a single heart. I did not interpret that as proof of transformation, but it was the first time she had shown me a list of harms without attaching explanations or blame. A week later, my mother called to discuss Christmas. She wanted the family together, but did not want to recreate a formal holiday dinner filled with expectations. She proposed appetizers, simple games, and an informal gathering at her house. No elaborate meal, and no pressure to pretend everything was normal. I said I was willing to try as long as Grant and I could leave if the atmosphere became hostile. My mother agreed. She sent the plan to the family group chat, and everyone, including Denise and Howard, said they would come. The following Saturday, Natalie and Trevor came to help us set up the nursery. Grant had painted the walls the weekend before, and we spent the day assembling furniture and organizing tiny clothes. Trevor worked on the crib while Natalie folded onesies beside me. She held up one that read, "Mommy's Little Miracle," and joked that this child would never lack family stories to discuss in therapy someday. I laughed harder than I expected. The joke was dark, but it felt good to laugh inside a room built for something hopeful. Grant brought pizza, and we ate on the floor among cardboard boxes. By evening, the crib and dresser were assembled, and the space finally looked like a nursery instead of a project. On Tuesday, a letter arrived in Denise's handwriting. It was 2 pages long. She wrote that her therapist had helped her organize her thoughts, but the words were her own. She apologized for every moment she had taken from me, every dollar she had taken from Grandma, and every lie used to preserve her image. She named my engagement, promotion, house purchase, pregnancy announcement, and the financial deception. For once, there were no excuses attached. She said she had acted that way because she felt like a failure and needed everyone else to see her as capable and essential. Denise wrote that she finally understood how often she had hurt people and how rarely she had offered a real apology. She was not asking me to trust her immediately or pretend the damage had disappeared. She only wanted me to know that she understood what she had done and was committed to changing even when the work felt humiliating. I read the letter twice, then gave it to Grant. He said it sounded like genuine progress. I agreed, though part of me remained braced for another crisis. A thoughtful letter could mark a beginning, but only consistent behavior would tell me whether the change was real. Christmas Eve came sooner than I expected. The week before, my mother confirmed that everyone still planned to attend. Denise had told her she was nervous, but would come with Howard. Grant reminded me that we were not trapped. If Denise became aggressive or controlling, we could leave. On Christmas Eve morning, my father texted that he had spoken to Howard. Counseling was helping them communicate honestly for the first time in years. Denise had disclosed every known account, given Howard access, and followed the repayment plan without complaint. My father said Howard was cautiously hopeful. When I asked whether the change would last, he said only time could answer that, but he had never seen Denise accept responsibility this way before. Grant and I arrived at my parents' house around noon. Natalie was arranging appetizers. Trevor arrived with a cheese board, and the house felt intentionally relaxed. My mother had placed cards and board games on the coffee table, instead of building the day around a perfect meal. Grandma Evelyn sat in her favorite chair near the window and looked calmer than she had at Thanksgiving. My mother stayed close to her without hovering. Denise and Howard arrived around 1 carrying a wrapped gift and a dish. Denise saw me across the room and gave a small wave. She did not rush over for a dramatic hug or call everyone's attention to our interaction. After setting down her things, she came to Grant and me and asked how I felt and whether the pregnancy was going well. I said the baby was healthy. She smiled and told us she was genuinely happy, then went to help my mother in the kitchen. Grant raised his eyebrows at me after she walked away. We had both noticed the restraint. All afternoon, Denise behaved differently. When Trevor told a long story about a disaster at work, she listened and asked questions, instead of interrupting with a story about herself. When Natalie mentioned considering a return to school, Denise asked what subject interested her, instead of immediately giving advice. When my father asked about my pregnancy, Denise allowed me to answer without taking over the conversation. She was present, but not directing the room. She sat with Grandma Evelyn without performing her devotion for an audience and did not discuss bills, bank accounts, or caregiving decisions. We played cards, and Denise laughed when she drew a terrible hand. Howard smiled more than I had seen him smile since Thanksgiving. Before dinner, Denise quietly handed me a wrapped box and said it was for the baby. Inside was a soft gray knitted blanket with small stars worked into the pattern. She had made it during the previous few weeks. She did not announce the gift or wait for the room to praise her. She simply watched my face and looked relieved when I told her it was beautiful. After dinner, my mother pulled me into the kitchen and thanked me for giving Denise a chance. She said seeing her sister make a real effort gave her hope that the family might eventually heal. I told her I was still cautious. One peaceful holiday could not erase 4 years of financial deception or decades of boundary violations. My mother said caution was fair. Hope did not require pretending the past had not happened. Denise stayed until about 8, then said the teenagers needed to get home. She hugged each person goodbye. Her hug with me was brief and ordinary. She told me to contact her if I ever needed something, but she did not pressure me to promise I would. After she left, Natalie asked what I thought. I said Denise seemed unlike the person we had known. Trevor suggested the crisis might finally have forced her to face herself. Grant agreed that the day showed progress, but reminded us that trust was rebuilt through repetition. I felt the same way. One good day was not a transformation, but it was a beginning. During the first week of January, my phone rang from a number I did not recognize. Denise was calling from her therapist's office. She said, "Doctor, Cole had suggested that 1 or 2 joint sessions might help us speak about our relationship with a neutral person present." The idea made my stomach drop. Sitting in a room with Denise and discussing years of resentment sounded exhausting, and I worried she might use therapy as another stage on which to control the story. Still, I thought about the baby and the kind of family environment I wanted to create. I did not need everyone to be close, but I wanted conflicts handled with honesty instead of secrecy, public scenes, and social media campaigns. I asked whether she actually wanted the session or was only agreeing because the therapist recommended it. Denise said she wanted it because she missed having me in her life and understood that she could not demand her way back in. I told her I needed time to think. She accepted that without pushing. I called Grant at work, and he said the decision was mine, but a professional in the room might make the conversation safer and more productive. Natalie said the same. Trevor promised to support whichever choice protected my peace. After 2 days, I texted Denise that I would attend 1 session and decide about any others afterward. 3 days later, I entered a small office building and found Denise already seated in the waiting room. She gave me a nervous smile. Neither of us spoke before Dr. Cole opened the door and invited us inside. He was a calm man in his 50s with glasses and a measured way of speaking. Denise and I sat at opposite ends of a couch while he took a chair facing us. He thanked me for coming and said the goal was not to force forgiveness or decide who had suffered more. The purpose was to let each of us describe the relationship honestly and identify what would be required for any trust to return. He asked me to begin. I said Denise's behavior over the years had made me feel that nothing important in my life truly belonged to me. Every engagement, promotion, house purchase, and private decision became information she could distribute. I stopped trusting her because telling her anything meant surrendering control over when and how it would be shared. The financial deception broke something even deeper. If she could exploit Grandma Evelyn, an elderly woman who trusted her completely, then I could not assume family loyalty would restrain her. The pregnancy was the final boundary, because Grant and I had already lost a baby. We needed the right to protect the news until we felt safe. Dr. Cole asked Denise to repeat what she believed she had heard, rather than immediately defend herself. Her eyes filled with tears, but she said I had experienced her involvement as theft, not support. She had taken ownership of moments that were mine, and taught me that privacy around her was impossible. She also said the money proved that her need to feel important had become dangerous. Hearing her put it that clearly affected me more than another apology would have. She was finally describing the impact instead of only her intention. Denise then explained that she had felt invisible for years. Being the person who knew everything, solved problems, and controlled family information made her feel as though she existed. She had been so focused on managing how others saw her that she rarely considered how her behavior landed on them. Dr. Cole asked me how it felt to hear that. I said it helped me understand the pattern, but understanding did not erase the harm. Denise nodded. She said she was not asking me to forget. She wanted the opportunity to behave differently long enough for me to judge her by what she did next. Dr. Cole said rebuilding trust required specific, observable behavior. Denise would need to ask before sharing information, accept no without punishment, avoid inserting herself into decisions, and tolerate not being the first person told. I would need the freedom to set limits without being pressured to reassure her. We both agreed to those terms. Over the next few weeks, I attended 2 more sessions. Denise and I also met for coffee a few times to practice having ordinary conversations without slipping into the old pattern. She worked at listening instead of waiting for an opening to redirect the subject toward herself. It was awkward sometimes, but the effort was visible. As my pregnancy progressed, my belly grew and the baby's movements became stronger. One morning, Denise texted to ask whether she could stop by that afternoon. She did not simply announce that she was coming. When I agreed, she arrived with a stack of labeled containers. She had spent the morning making soups, casseroles, and pasta dishes for our freezer, so Grant and I would have easy meals after the baby came. Each container included simple heating instructions. She said she remembered how exhausting the early weeks had been with her own children and thought food might be useful. I was touched because the gesture addressed an actual need rather than creating an audience for her generosity. Denise asked whether there was anything else I wanted. I said I did not know yet because first-time parenthood still felt abstract. She told me I could ask later, and added that she did not expect to be in the delivery room or to receive immediate updates. She only wanted to help in ways Grant and I welcomed. She stayed for about half an hour, then left. When Grant came home and saw the freezer, he said her effort was becoming harder to dismiss as performance. 2 weeks later, on a Tuesday night, I was sitting on the couch when I felt an unfamiliar cramp. A few minutes later, my water broke in the living room. I called for Grant, and he came running. He grabbed the hospital bag we had packed, helped me into the car, and drove while the contractions became stronger. I breathed the way we had practiced in class. From the road, Grant called my parents. My mother asked whether we wanted her to tell Denise. I surprised myself by saying yes. Denise was still family, and despite everything, I wanted her to know that the baby was coming. Grant dropped me at the hospital entrance before parking. A nurse brought a wheelchair and took me to labor and delivery. The doctor said I was already 4 centimeters dilated. As the contractions intensified, I requested an epidural. Once the pain eased, Grant sat beside me holding my hand. My parents arrived around 10 that night. My mother kept telling me I was doing well, while my father looked more frightened than I felt. Labor continued through the night. Around 8 the next morning, the doctor said it was time to push. Grant stood beside me and coached me through each contraction. After what felt endless, I heard a cry, and the doctor told us we had a son. They placed him on my chest, warm and impossibly small, with a cap of dark hair. Grant cried openly. I did too. For a while, neither of us could say anything except that he was here. The nurses weighed him at 8 pounds, 1 ounce, wrapped him, and returned him to my arms. After the miscarriage, the years of trying, and the fear that had followed me through the pregnancy, holding him felt almost unreal. My parents came in first. My mother cried while holding her grandson, and my father took more photographs than anyone needed. They stayed about an hour, then left so we could rest. Natalie and Trevor arrived later with flowers and a stuffed elephant. Natalie said the baby was beautiful. Trevor looked terrified when I offered to let him hold the baby, but once the little boy settled in his arms, he grinned the entire time. Denise and Howard visited last. Denise carried a gift bag and approached the bed carefully. She asked whether she could hold him. When I said yes, she took him and looked down at his face. Her expression softened, and tears ran down her cheeks. She whispered that he was beautiful, and told me I would be a wonderful mother. She did not make a speech, take over the room, or insist on photographs. After about 20 minutes, she handed him back and said, Grant and I needed rest. Then she and Howard left. She had respected every boundary, without making me repeat one. The first weeks at home were more difficult than I had imagined. The baby cried often, sleep came in fragments, and I sometimes felt as if an entire day had passed without my completing a single task. Grant returned to work after 2 weeks, which left me alone for long stretches while still recovering physically. Denise texted every few days, but she offered specific help rather than vague promises. She would ask whether I wanted groceries, a meal, or someone to hold the baby while I showered. She never appeared without permission, and never acted offended when I said we were fine. One afternoon, exhaustion caught up with me. I had barely slept, the baby would not settle, and I felt too tired to think clearly. I texted Denise and asked whether she could hold him for an hour while I rested. She arrived 15 minutes later. I went upstairs and fell asleep while she rocked him downstairs. When I woke, I felt human again. Denise had also washed the dishes and folded a basket of laundry. I thanked her. She said, "That is what family is for." The sentence was one she had used for years, but this time it felt different. She had helped because I asked, not because she wanted praise for being indispensable. At the baby's 2-month checkup, the pediatrician said he was healthy and gaining weight exactly as expected. Grant and I were beginning to recognize his different cries and understand his routines. Support from relatives who respected our decisions made the adjustment easier. My mother visited once a week so I could rest. Natalie brought dinner. Trevor checked in and made jokes when I needed them. Denise continued to offer help without pressing if I declined. When my son was about 10 weeks old, Denise and I met for coffee. She said therapy had forced her to consider who she was when she was not acting as the family's fixer. For years, she had built her identity around being needed and had no life that belonged only to her. She had started a pottery class on Saturday mornings and joined a walking group. The activities sounded small, but they gave her places to exist without controlling anyone else. She was continuing the repayment plan, and Grandma Evelyn's accounts remained secure under my mother's management and the attorney's oversight. Denise seemed lighter because she was no longer constantly defending an image. My father later told Grant that Howard believed their marriage was more honest than it had been in years. They were still working through the betrayal, and Howard had not forgotten what happened, but they were finally discussing money, shame, and resentment instead of hiding them. The crisis had forced them to face problems buried for a decade. Howard said he was grateful they had the chance to rebuild on truth, rather than continue quietly falling apart inside a false version of their marriage. When the baby was 3 months old, Grant and I invited the family over for pizza and salad. My parents came, along with Natalie, Trevor, Denise, Howard, and Grandma Evelyn. The children ran through the backyard while the adults talked. Denise helped set the table and watched the younger kids without taking command. She complimented Natalie's haircut, asked Trevor about his new job, and listened to the answers. When she held the baby, she handed him back as soon as he fussed, instead of insisting that only she could calm him. Grandma Evelyn sat in the most comfortable chair with a blanket over her knees. At one point, I watched Denise bring her a plate and sit beside her. There was no audience around them, and no speech about sacrifice. They simply talked. The sight did not erase the money or restore the trust that had been broken, but it showed me what accountability could look like when it continued beyond an apology. Grandma's finances were protected. Denise was repaying what she could, and the family no longer relied on secrecy to keep the peace. The gathering remained calm from beginning to end. After everyone left, I sat in the nursery rocking my son as he fell asleep against my chest. I thought about Thanksgiving, the screaming, the shattered wine glass, Howard's stunned face, and Grandma Evelyn's frightened question about her house. It had been the worst night our family had ever experienced. It was also the night the truth finally became impossible to avoid. What followed was not a simple story of revenge or instant forgiveness. Denise faced consequences because of choices she had made over years. She lost control of Grandma's accounts, nearly lost her marriage, had to disclose hidden debt, enter counseling, and repay money she had taken. The rest of us had to confront how easily we had rewarded her need for control because it was convenient to let one person manage everything. I had to learn that exposing harm could feel cruel, even when silence would have allowed it to continue. Denise did not become a different person in one conversation. She changed through repeated actions, respecting a no, waiting for permission, telling the truth about money, listening without interrupting, and helping without demanding credit. Grandma's home and remaining funds were safe. Howard and Denise were rebuilding their marriage with full financial transparency. My mother had oversight and professional support instead of carrying the responsibility alone. Natalie and Trevor no longer treated Denise's boundary violations as harmless family quirks, and I no longer handed over private parts of my life just to prevent someone else from becoming upset. My son shifted in my arms and settled again. I looked down at him and felt grateful that he would grow up in a family that was finally healthier, even if the path to that health had been painful. He would know Denise not only as the aunt who once threw a wine glass across a Thanksgiving dining room, but also as the woman who was forced to face what she had become and chose, day after day, to become someone more honest. I laid him in his crib, watched him breathe for another minute, and went downstairs to Grant, knowing that the truth had broken our old family pattern, but it had also given us the chance to build something better.